Chapter 1: Shadows of the Past. The moon shone brightly in the cloudless night sky, illuminating the old mansion that stood on the hill like a dark sentinel guarding its secrets. Known locally as the House of Shadows, this house has stood here for over a century, and its dark history has been filled with rumors and legends. The wind rustled in the treetops, creating the illusion of whispering voices that seemed to be trying to warn against coming closer. The mansion belonged to the Van Rijt family, who were among the first settlers of this area. It was said that each of them took terrible secrets with them to the grave, and that their spirits still roamed the dark corridors of the house. After the last tragic incident, which occurred more than 40 years ago, the House of Shadows remained empty. No one dared to go there, and even local teenagers who loved thrills avoided it. But one warm summer evening, everything changed. Jackson Miller, a young historian passionate about studying ancient legends, comes to a small town to explore the past of the Van Rijt family and their sinister mansion. He was sure that here he would find something more than just dusty pages of archives and old photographs. Jackson stayed at a small hotel in the city center. The innkeeper, Mrs. Harris, an elderly woman with kind eyes and gray hair, immediately warned him that it was better to stay away from the House of Shadows. "This house," she said, sipping tea, "has brought a lot of trouble to this city. People disappeared. Some went crazy, and others simply disappeared as if they had never existed. I wouldn't go there if I were you." But Jackson was determined. He spent a lot of time in the library, studying old newspapers and documents collected by the local historical society. He learned about mysterious disappearances, unsolved murders, and strange incidents associated with the Van Rijt family. The next evening, when the sun was already setting below the horizon, Jackson decided to go to the House of Shadows. He took a flashlight, a notepad, and a camera with him. He was overcome by a strange feeling of anticipation and slight fear, but he tried not to think about the bad. After all, he was a scientist, and his job was to find answers to questions, not to be afraid of dark legends. The mansion greeted him with gloomy silence. The wind howled through the empty windows, and the old oak doors seemed to have not been opened for many years. Jackson pushed the door, and it unexpectedly gave in easily, creaking and opening the way into the darkness. He turned on the flashlight and carefully walked inside. The inside of the house seemed even more sinister. Shadows played on the walls, and every sound echoed, enhancing the atmosphere of mystery and horror. Jackson shined the flashlight on the dusty portraits hanging on the walls. The faces on them seemed alive, watching his every move. He headed deeper into the house, examining the old furniture covered in a thick layer of dust and the newspapers scattered on the floor. It seemed that time had stopped here. Jackson walked through several rooms before coming across a large library. The tall shelves filled with books seemed endless, and the smell of old pages hung in the air. On one of the tables, he noticed an old diary. Upon opening it, Jackson realized that it was the personal diary of the last owner of the house, Edward Van Rijt. The diary described the strange events that took place in the house: rustling noises at night, ghostly figures, and unexplained disappearances. The more he read, the more he realized that the family's history was much darker than he could have imagined. Suddenly, something creaked in the house. Jackson turned around sharply but saw no one. His heart beat faster. He took a few steps back, and then the flashlight began to blink and then went out completely. Darkness enveloped him, and the silence became unbearable. Jackson tried to turn on the flashlight, but was unsuccessful. The silence was broken by a quiet whisper coming from the depths of the house. Jackson froze, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The whisper became louder, and soon he could already distinguish individual words. It seemed as if someone was calling his name. Gathering all his courage, Jackson headed towards the sound. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. The whisper led him to an old door that seemed to be locked for centuries. He pushed it open, and the door creaked open, revealing a small room illuminated by the dim moonlight filtering through the broken window. In the center of the room stood a figure in an ancient dress. It was a woman. Her face was pale, and her eyes glowed with a strange light. Jackson felt his blood run cold. "You have come," she whispered, and her voice echoed in his head. "You must find out the truth." He wanted to ask who she was, but the words got stuck in his throat. The woman pointed to an old chest standing in the corner of the room. Jackson walked slowly over to it and opened it. Inside were old letters, photographs, and some strange artifacts. "This is all that remains of my family," the woman said. "We were all cursed because of one mistake made many years ago." Jackson began to read the letters and realized that they were telling a story of betrayal, greed, and revenge. The Van Rijt family was involved in dark affairs, and their crimes led to a terrible curse that fell on every member of the family. Suddenly, he felt a cold wind and the room began to spin. Things around him began to move on their own, and the whispers turned into screams. The woman disappeared, leaving him alone in a whirlwind of darkness and fear. Jackson tried to get out of the room, but the doors closed in front of him. Panic overtook him, and he began banging on the door, screaming and begging for help. But it was all in vain. The room filled with darkness, and Jackson felt his consciousness begin to fade. The last thing he heard before plunging into endless darkness was a woman's voice. "You've opened Pandora's box, Jackson. Now you are part of this story." And with these words, he lost consciousness, plunging into a world of shadows and forgotten secrets. When he woke up, the house was silent. The flashlight started working again, and Jackson realized that he was lying on the floor in the same room. There was no sign of the strange woman or the old chest around him. He stood up slowly, feeling weak and dizzy. He thought it was all a dream, but the letters and photographs he found were still in his hands. Jackson realized that this place hides even more secrets than he could have imagined. And now he was determined to find out the whole truth about the House of Shadows and its inhabitants. He knew that this path would be dangerous, but he had no other choice. The shadows of the past had already begun their play, and now he had to reveal all their secrets. Thus began his long and dangerous journey to the truth, which will lead him to the darkest corners of the history of the Van Rijt family and the solution to their terrible curse. Chapter 2: Forgotten Secrets. Several days had passed since Jackson first crossed the threshold of the House of Shadows. Every night he was plagued by nightmares, in which he saw dark silhouettes and heard muffled screams. However, despite the fear and doubts, his desire to uncover the mansion's secrets only grew stronger. The next day, he returned to the library to delve into the archives and find additional information about the Van Rijt family. The locals avoided him, as if his presence reminded them of something dreadful. Only Mrs. Harris, the elderly innkeeper, occasionally tried to talk to him and warn him against further research. "I understand that you're drawn to uncover the truth," she said once over a cup of tea, "but some secrets are better left unsolved. Sometimes knowledge brings more harm than good." But Jackson was adamant. He felt he was on the verge of an important discovery that could change his understanding of the Van Rijt family and the House of Shadows itself. He decided to continue his search, despite all the warnings. One day, while digging through old documents, he came across records that seemed untouched for decades. They mentioned a certain Jonathan Van Rijt, Edward's younger brother, whose name rarely appeared in other sources. According to these records, Jonathan was involved in strange and mysterious experiments conducted in the mansion's basement. Jackson felt this could be the key to unraveling many mysteries. He decided to return to the House of Shadows and find this basement. As night fell, he headed back to the mansion, this time more prepared. In his backpack were a flashlight, a camera, a notebook, and a small set of tools. The mansion greeted him with the same eerie silence. Entering inside, Jackson immediately headed to where he believed the entrance to the basement might be. After passing through several rooms, he finally found an old door, half hidden behind a heavy curtain. The door was locked, but Jackson, armed with lockpicks, soon dealt with the lock. With a creak, the door opened, revealing a narrow staircase leading down. The darkness below seemed impenetrable, but Jackson, turning on his flashlight, resolutely began to descend. The steps creaked quietly under his feet, and the air was filled with the smell of mold and dampness. At the bottom, he discovered a large room filled with antique equipment and strange objects. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of various substances, ancient books, and peculiar artifacts. Jackson carefully examined every detail, trying to understand what exactly Jonathan Van Rijt had been working on. On one of the tables, he found a diary that apparently belonged to Jonathan himself. The pages of the diary were covered in fine handwriting, and Jackson began to read, hoping to find answers to his questions. Jonathan described his experiments, which included research in the fields of alchemy and the occult. He sought to uncover the secrets of immortality and the afterlife, and his experiments became increasingly dark and dangerous. The diary mentioned rituals requiring sacrifices and contacts with otherworldly forces. The further Jackson read, the more he realized that Jonathan Van Rijt was not just a scientist but a true madman, willing to do anything to achieve his goals. The descriptions of the rituals and experiments were so horrifying that Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. Suddenly, his attention was caught by an entry in which Jonathan mentioned a certain artifact hidden deep in the basement. This artifact, he claimed, possessed incredible power and could grant its owner control over life and death. Jackson realized that this artifact might be the key to all the mysteries of the House of Shadows. He continued exploring the basement, trying to find the mentioned artifact. In a distant corner of the room, he discovered another door, locked with a massive padlock. Using his tools, Jackson soon opened it. Behind the door was a small room, dimly lit by an old lamp. In the center of the room stood a table with a strange object wrapped in old cloth. Jackson carefully unwrapped the cloth and saw an ancient medallion with an unusual symbol engraved on its surface. As he took the medallion in his hands, he felt a cold shiver run through his body. This artifact clearly held some power, but he couldn't understand what kind. Suddenly, the room was filled with a strange sound, like a quiet whisper. Jackson turned and saw a dark figure appear in the corner of the room. It was the silhouette of a person, but the features of their face were indistinguishable. The figure slowly approached him, and Jackson felt fear grip him. "You shouldn't have touched it," the figure said, and its voice echoed through the room. "Now you are cursed, like all those who came here before you." Jackson wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving him alone in the dark room. He realized he had to leave this place as soon as possible. Putting the medallion into his backpack, Jackson hurried upstairs, feeling as if something invisible was watching him. Emerging from the basement, he locked the door and headed for the mansion's exit. Stepping outside, Jackson felt the cold wind on his face. He glanced back at the House of Shadows and realized that he was no longer just a researcher, but a participant in the very dark story he had been trying to unravel. Returning to the inn, he locked himself in his room and began to carefully study the medallion. Its surface was covered with strange symbols that Jackson couldn't decipher. He knew he had to find a way to understand the meaning of these symbols and the power they carried. The next day, he went to the nearby university town to consult with scholars and experts in the occult sciences. There, he met Professor Alan Carter, a specialist in ancient languages and symbolism. Professor Carter examined the medallion closely and studied its symbols for a long time. Finally, he said, "This medallion is truly unique. The symbols on it belong to an ancient culture about which little is known. But one thing is certain: this artifact holds great power, and using it can be extremely dangerous." Jackson told the professor about his findings and what had happened in the basement of the House of Shadows. Carter was astonished and offered to help him with further research. They began studying Jonathan Van Rijt's diary and analyzing the symbols on the medallion. Each day brought new discoveries, but also new dangers. Jackson felt that the forces within the medallion were beginning to affect him. One night, while working on another text, Jackson heard a strange noise. Turning around, he saw that the medallion was glowing with a faint light. At that moment, he felt something invisible starting to penetrate his consciousness. It seemed to him that he saw strange visions in which dark figures whispered in his ear, trying to convey something. He realized that the medallion was not just an artifact, but a kind of key to the world of shadows and otherworldly beings. Now he had to not only uncover the secrets of the Van Rijt family, but also find a way to resist the forces awakened by this ancient item. Several weeks passed, and Jackson, along with Professor Carter, gathered a wealth of data. They discovered that the medallion was indeed connected to ancient rituals used by priests to communicate with the otherworld. Jonathan Van Rijt had likely tried to use it to achieve immortality and control over spirits. But the most important discovery was yet to come. One day they came across an entry that spoke of a summoning ritual that could only be performed at a certain time and place. This ritual, Jonathan claimed, could open the gates to the world of shadows and allow control over the forces dwelling there. Jackson realized that this ritual might be the key to everything. If he could perform it, he might not only understand the medallion's power, but also rid himself of the curse hanging over the House of Shadows. He and Professor Carter began preparing for the ritual, carefully studying all the details and components. The necessary ingredients were rare and dangerous, and finding them took a long time. However, Jackson was determined. He knew this was his only chance to uncover all the mysteries and free himself from the dark influence of the medallion. When everything was ready, they returned to the House of Shadows. The night was dark and moonless, and the wind howled as if warning of impending doom. Jackson and Carter entered the basement and began preparations for the ritual. They laid out the ingredients on an altar, drew a circle on the floor, and lit candles. The medallion lay in the center of the circle, emitting a strange light. Jackson began reading the ancient text they had deciphered. With each word, he felt the atmosphere around them growing tenser. Suddenly, the candles flickered, and the darkness around them began to thicken. Jackson continued reading despite the mounting fear. At that moment, the medallion began to glow brighter, and dark figures appeared around the circle. These were the spirits summoned by the ritual, and their whispers grew louder. Carter, trembling with fear, tried to stop the ritual, but it was too late. Jackson felt an invisible force grab him, and he found himself at the center of a vortex of shadows and light. The spirits surrounded him, their faces contorted in horrific grimaces. "You have opened the gates," one of the spirits said. "Now you must pay the price." Jackson felt his consciousness beginning to dissolve in the vortex. He realized he had made a mistake, and that the forces he had contacted were much stronger than he could have imagined. At that moment, he heard Carter's voice shouting something, but the words were lost in the roar of shadows. Suddenly, the medallion exploded in a bright light, and Jackson felt himself being pulled back into reality. He awoke on the basement floor, surrounded by fragments of the medallion. Carter was nearby, trying to revive him. "You're alive, Carter," whispered with relief. But something went wrong. The spirits were too strong. Jackson slowly got up, feeling weak and dizzy. He realized the ritual had failed and the medallion was destroyed. But most importantly, he understood that the forces he had tried to control were now free. They left the basement and exited the House of Shadows, feeling that something had changed. The wind, previously calm, now howled as if warning of an approaching storm. Jackson knew his investigation had only just begun and that more mysteries and dangers lay ahead. He decided to return to the city and continue studying the records and diaries he had found. Now his goal was clear. He had to learn how to stop the forces awakened in the House of Shadows and once and for all free himself and the mansion from the curse hanging over it. Jackson and Carter returned to the university and continued their research. They studied ancient texts, consulted with other scholars, and searched for new ways to resist the forces hidden in the shadows. Every day brought new discoveries, but also new dangers. Jackson felt himself sinking deeper into the world of shadows, and the investigation was changing him. He began noticing strange things, shadows moving on their own, whispers coming from nowhere, and eerie visions haunting his dreams. One night, while working on another text, he heard a quiet knock at the door. Turning around, he saw a dark figure standing in the doorway. The figure slowly entered the room, and Jackson felt his heart tighten with fear. "You have disrupted the balance," the figure said, its voice echoing through the room. "Now you must set it right." Jackson realized this was one of the spirits summoned by the ritual. He knew he had to find a way to deal with them, but he didn't know how yet. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving him in eerie silence. The next day, he told Carter about what had happened, and they decided to seek help from other specialists. They found an expert in occult sciences, Professor Lawrence Graves, who agreed to help them with their research. Graves was a man with extensive knowledge in occult sciences and ancient rituals. He listened attentively to their story and offered his assistance in performing a new ritual that could close the gates to the world of shadows and restore balance. They began preparing for the new ritual, carefully studying all the details and components. Graves brought with him many rare books and artifacts that could help with their task. Jackson and Carter worked day and night, trying to understand how to conduct the ritual and avoid the mistakes made last time. Finally, everything was ready. They returned to the House of Shadows, this time with Graves, to perform the ritual and close the gates. The night was grim, and the shadows seemed even more sinister. Jackson felt the tension rising with each step. They entered the basement and began preparations for the ritual. Graves laid out his artifacts, drew a circle on the floor, and lit candles. Jackson and Carter stood nearby, ready to help at any moment. Graves began reading the ancient text, and the atmosphere in the room grew even more tense. The candles flickered, and the darkness around them began to thicken. Suddenly, they heard a quiet whisper coming from deep within the basement. "We must continue," Graves said, not stopping his reading. "We cannot let them win." Jackson and Carter nodded, continuing to support the circle. At that moment, the shadows began to move, and the spirits summoned by the ritual appeared around them. Their faces were contorted in horrific grimaces, and the whispering grew louder. Graves continued reading despite the mounting fear. Suddenly, one of the spirits approached Jackson and said, "Do you think you can defeat us? You are just a man." Jackson felt panic grip him, but he knew he had to remain strong. He remembered everything he had learned about the ritual and began helping Graves, reading the words in the ancient language. With each word spoken, the shadows grew weaker and the spirits began to disappear. Finally, the ritual was completed and the room fell into silence. Jackson felt the invisible force release him, and he fell to his knees, feeling relief and exhaustion. Graves approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," he said. "The gates are closed, and the spirits can no longer trouble this world." Jackson and Carter breathed a sigh of relief. They knew this was only the first step in their fight against the dark forces, but now they had confidence in their abilities and knowledge. They returned to the university and continued their research, but now they knew that every step had to be carefully thought out and considered. Jackson understood that many trials and mysteries still awaited him, but he was ready for them. Now his goal was clear. He had to continue studying the secrets of the House of Shadows and find a way to rid this world of the sinister forces hiding in the shadows once and for all. And although his path was fraught with dangers, Jackson knew he could overcome any difficulties if he believed in himself and his friends. Chapter 3: Shadows of the Past. Several months had passed since Jackson, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves closed the gate to the shadow world in the basement of the House of Shadows. Although they managed to temporarily stop the dark forces, they knew it was only a temporary measure. Jackson continued to study Jonathan Van Rijt's diaries and ancient texts to find a way to permanently rid them of the curse. During this time, the team had new members. Professor Carter invited his longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Raven, a specialist in mythology and the occult. Elizabeth was known for her research on ancient rituals and magical artifacts. They were also joined by a young and talented archaeologist, Alexei Volkov, who had recently returned from an expedition to Egypt, where he found artifacts related to ancient cultures. Jackson, Elizabeth, and Alexei gathered in the university library, where Professor Graves had prepared a collection of rare books and manuscripts for them. They hoped that together they could unravel the mystery of the medallion and find a way to close the gate to the shadow world once and for all. "We need to focus on studying the symbols and rituals described in Jonathan's diaries," Jackson began. "Maybe we missed some important details." "I agree," Elizabeth nodded. "Also, we should pay attention to the mythological aspects. Perhaps these symbols and rituals are connected to ancient myths about the underworld." "I have a few ideas," Alexei added. "In my last expedition, I found artifacts that might be related to your research. Maybe they can help us understand how to proceed." The team got to work, each focusing on their area of research. Jackson and Elizabeth focused on analyzing the symbols and rituals described in the diaries, while Alexei studied his artifacts and looked for possible connections to other ancient cultures. Weeks passed, and their research began to bear fruit. Elizabeth discovered that the symbols on the medallion and in Jonathan's diaries were related to ancient myths about the underworld and the passage of souls. She suggested that Jonathan's rituals might have been based on these myths and used to open the gates to the shadow world. Alexei, in turn, found similarities between the artifacts he had found and the descriptions of rituals in the diaries. He suggested that Jonathan van Rijt had used ancient knowledge passed down through generations to create his rituals. Jackson, studying the texts, found a mention of a certain shadow key that could permanently close the gates. This key, according to legend, was hidden in one of the ancient temples located in present-day Europe. "We need to find this temple and the key," Jackson said. "It's our only chance to get rid of the curse once and for all." Elizabeth and Alexei agreed, and they began planning an expedition to find the temple. Professor Graves provided them with maps and additional materials that could help in their search. The team set off for Europe, where, according to legend, the ancient temple was located. The journey was long and dangerous, but they were determined to find the key and finish what they had started. After several weeks of searching and researching, they finally came across ancient ruins, which they believed could be the very temple. The ruins were hidden deep in the forest, and reaching them was not easy. Entering the temple, they saw numerous symbols and inscriptions on the walls, reminiscent of those in Jonathan's diaries. The team began to explore the temple, hoping to find the key. On one of the altars, they discovered an ancient chest sealed with magical symbols. Elizabeth, after studying the symbols, figured out how to open the chest without triggering a protective spell. Inside, they found an ancient artifact that, by all indications, was the very shadow key. Jackson took the artifact in his hands and felt a cold energy run through his body. He understood that this key possessed great power and needed to be used with caution. The team returned to the House of Shadows, preparing for the final ritual. The night was dark, and the tension grew with every hour. They knew this was their last chance to close the gate and get rid of the curse. Entering the basement, they began preparing for the ritual. Elizabeth and Alexei set up the ingredients and artifacts, while Jackson took the key and stood in the center of the circle. Professors Carter and Graves supported them, ready to help at any moment. Jackson began to read the ancient text they had found in the temple. With each word spoken, the atmosphere around them grew more tense. Shadows began to move, and the spirits appeared around the circle again. Their whispers grew louder. "We must continue," Graves said, not stopping his reading. "We can't let them win." Jackson and his team continued the ritual despite the mounting fear. Suddenly, the key began to glow brightly, and the shadows started to weaken. Jackson felt the invisible force release him, and he fell to his knees, holding the key in his hands. The ritual was completed, and the room fell into silence. Jackson and his friends felt relief and exhaustion. They knew they had managed to close the gate and rid themselves of the curse. Now they knew their research had not been in vain and that they had managed to overcome the dark forces. Jackson, Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves returned to the university, where they continued their research, confident they could handle any difficulties and uncover even more mysteries. However, despite their success, Jackson understood that the world of shadows still held many secrets and dangers. Now his goal was clear: to continue studying the secrets hidden in the shadows and protect our world from the sinister forces ready to break free. Several months passed after their return to the university, and Jackson continued his research. He felt that the shadows had not entirely let go of him, and that their influence was still present in his life. Sometimes he saw strange visions and heard whispers coming from nowhere. One night, while working on another text, he heard a quiet knock at the door. Turning around, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Elizabeth, who also couldn't sleep due to troubling thoughts. "Jackson, I feel like we've missed something important," she said, approaching. "I keep thinking about those symbols and rituals. Maybe we should return to the House of Shadows and continue our research there." Jackson nodded. He also felt that their work was not yet finished. They decided to gather the team again and return to the House of Shadows to finally deal with the curse and the dark forces. They informed Professor Carter and Professor Graves of their decision, and they agreed to help. Alexei also joined them, feeling that his knowledge and experience could be useful. Returning to the House of Shadows, they began to explore it more thoroughly, paying attention to every detail. They found many new records and symbols that could help in their further research. One of their discoveries was an ancient artifact hidden in one of the secret passages. This artifact was the key to understanding the rituals and symbols used by Jonathan van Rijt. They began to study it and found that it could serve as a means of controlling shadows and spirits. Jackson and his team realized that Jonathan van Rijt not only sought immortality but also tried to control the world of shadows. They decided to use their knowledge and the artifact they had found to rid themselves of the curse once and for all and close the gate. Preparing for the final ritual, they began it that same night. Jackson again stood in the center of the circle, holding the artifact in his hands. Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves helped him, reading the ancient texts and supporting the magical circle. The ritual was complex and dangerous, but they were determined to complete it. The shadows began to move again, and the spirits appeared around the circle. Their whispers grew louder, and the room filled with tension. Suddenly, the artifact began to glow brightly, and the shadows started to disappear. Jackson felt the invisible force release him, and he fell to the basement floor, holding the artifact in his hands. The ritual was completed, and the room fell into silence. Jackson and his friends felt relief and exhaustion. They knew they had managed to close the gate and rid themselves of the curse. Now they knew their research had not been in vain, and that they had managed to overcome the dark forces. Jackson, Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves returned to the university, where they continued their research, confident they could handle any difficulties and uncover even more mysteries. However, despite their success, Jackson understood that the world of shadows still held many secrets and dangers. Now his goal was clear: to continue studying the secrets hidden in the shadows and protect our world from the sinister forces ready to break free. Chapter 4: Secrets of Eternal Darkness. After returning to the university, Jackson, Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves couldn't shake the feeling that their mission was not yet complete. Despite closing the gates and lifting the curse, the shadows continued to influence their lives. Jackson often saw disturbing visions, Elizabeth heard strange whispers, and Alexei felt an inexplicable unease. One day, while studying ancient manuscripts in the library, Jackson came across a mention of a mysterious book called Secrets of Eternal Darkness. According to legend, this book contained knowledge about the shadow world and could help them permanently rid themselves of its influence. However, the book had been lost for centuries, and no one knew where it was. Jackson gathered the whole team to discuss his discovery. They decided that finding Secrets of Eternal Darkness would be their next goal. If this book truly exists, Jackson began, it might hold the answers to many of our questions. We must find it to finally rid ourselves of the shadows. But where do we start looking? Alexei asked. The book has been lost for centuries. We don't even know where to begin. I have an idea, Elizabeth said, pulling out an old map. According to legend, the book was last seen in one of the ancient monasteries in Transylvania. This might be our chance. The team agreed and began preparing for the expedition. Professor Carter and Professor Graves provided the necessary resources and assistance so they could embark on their journey as soon as possible. The journey to Transylvania was long and dangerous. They crossed mountains and forests, faced challenges and unpredictable weather conditions, but each team member was determined to find the book. After several weeks of travel, they finally reached the ancient monastery Elizabeth had mentioned. The monastery was abandoned and half-ruined, but its atmosphere inspired both awe and fear. Upon entering, they began to explore every room and corridor in search of clues about the book's location. In one of the monastery's old libraries, they found numerous ancient texts and manuscripts. Elizabeth and Jackson carefully examined each one, hoping to find hints about the whereabouts of Secrets of Eternal Darkness. There's something here, Elizabeth said, discovering a hidden passage behind one of the shelves. This might lead us to the book. The passage led to the monastery's underground catacombs. They descended, lighting their way with torches. The atmosphere grew more ominous, and every sound echoed through the corridors. Jackson felt the tension mount with each step. We must be careful, he said, feeling a chill run through his body. Anything could be down here. They continued forward until they reached a large hall filled with ancient relics and artifacts. In the center of the hall stood an altar, upon which lay an old book with a black cover. Jackson immediately knew that this was Secrets of Eternal Darkness. "We found it," he said, approaching. "Now we need to understand how to use its knowledge." He carefully opened the book and began to read. The pages were filled with ancient symbols and spells. Elizabeth and Alexei joined him, helping to decipher the texts. "This describes rituals and spells that can help us control the shadows and spirits," Elizabeth said. "But this is very dangerous knowledge. We must be cautious." "We need time to study everything," Alexei added. "Let's return to the university and continue our research there." They returned to the university with Secrets of Eternal Darkness and began meticulously studying every section of the book. The more they read, the more they understood that the book contained not only answers to their questions, but also new mysteries and dangers. One of the most important discoveries was a description of an ancient ritual that could permanently seal the gates to the shadow world. This ritual required the use of several artifacts and the performance of complex spells. They realized that finding and preparing everything necessary would not be easy. "This ritual is our only chance," Jackson said, "but it is very complex. We must be ready for any challenges." "I know where to find one of the artifacts," Alexei said, pointing to one of the maps. "During my last expedition to Egypt, I found an artifact that might be part of the ritual. And another artifact might be in one of the old temples in India," Elizabeth added. According to ancient texts, this temple is guarded by spirits and hidden from prying eyes. The team split up. Jackson and Elizabeth headed to India, while Alexei and Professor Carter went to Egypt. Professor Graves stayed at the university to continue researching the book and to maintain contact with the team. The journeys were full of dangers and trials. In India, Jackson and Elizabeth faced ancient traps and spirits guarding the temple. They had to use all their knowledge and skills to find the artifact and return alive. "That was not easy," Jackson said, holding an ancient amulet, "but now we have what we need." In Egypt, Alexei and Professor Carter also faced difficulties. The artifact was hidden in a tomb protected by a curse. They had to use all their archaeological skills and knowledge of ancient rituals to lift the curse and retrieve the artifact. "We did it," Alexei said, holding an ancient staff. "Now we can return and complete the ritual." When everyone returned to the university, they began preparing for the final ritual. They gathered all the necessary artifacts and carefully studied every detail of the ritual. Jackson, Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves knew this was their last chance to permanently rid themselves of the curse and close the gates. The night of the ritual was dark and grim. The university was silent, and only the whispers of ancient spells broke it. Jackson stood in the center of the magic circle, holding the amulet and staff. Elizabeth and Alexei supported him, reading the ancient texts and maintaining the magic circle. "We must be ready for any surprises," Jackson said, feeling a chill run through his body. "The shadows will try to stop us." "We can do this," Elizabeth replied, gripping the book tighter. "We have no other choice." They began the ritual, chanting ancient spells and following every instruction from the book. The atmosphere around them grew more intense, and the shadows began to move. The spirits appeared around the circle, their whispers growing louder. "We must continue," Professor Carter said. "We cannot let them win." Jackson and his team pressed on despite the fear and tension. Suddenly, the artifacts began to glow brightly, and the shadows started to weaken. Jackson felt an invisible force release him, and he found himself on the floor, holding the amulet and staff in his hands. The ritual was complete, and the room fell silent. Jackson and his friends felt relief and exhaustion. They understood that they had managed to close the gates and lift the curse. Now they knew that their research had not been in vain and that they had been able to overcome the dark forces. Jackson, Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves returned to their studies, confident that they could face any challenges and uncover even more mysteries. However, despite their success, Jackson understood that the shadow world still held many secrets and dangers. Now his goal was clear: to continue studying the secrets hidden in the shadows and to protect our world from the sinister forces ready to break free. Chapter 5: The Gate to the Netherworld. After several weeks of intense research, Jackson and his team concluded that Secrets of Eternal Darkness contained not only information on how to close the gates, but also how to open them. Elizabeth was the first to notice the ancient symbols and spells that indicated the possibility of opening a portal to the shadow world. "If we can open the gates and enter the shadow world," she said, gathering the team, "we'll have a chance to understand their nature and possibly find a way to rid ourselves of their influence forever." "It's too risky," Professor Carter objected. "We don't know what's waiting for us there." "But it might be our only chance," Alexei added. "We have to try." They decided to conduct an experimental ritual to see what would happen. Jackson, Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves began preparing for the ritual. They chose a safe location at the university and gathered all the necessary artifacts. The night they decided to perform the ritual was dark and starless, as if nature itself was warning them of the impending dangers. Performing the ritual, the team stood in a magical circle, holding the artifacts. Jackson began reciting ancient spells from the book, and the air around them started to tremble. The artifacts glowed, and a bright glowing circle appeared on the ground. Professor Graves and Professor Carter chanted words of support, while Alexei and Elizabeth ensured the ritual was performed correctly. "We need to be careful," Jackson said, feeling the energy of the ritual intensify. "We don't know what might happen." When Jackson spoke the final words of the spell, the ground beneath them began to shake. In the center of the circle, a vortex appeared, absorbing light and air around them. Jackson felt an invisible force pulling him in. "What's happening?" Alexei shouted, trying to stay on his feet. Suddenly, darkness enveloped them, and they felt a chill pierce their bodies. They sensed themselves being torn from reality, and in an instant, they found themselves in another world. The Netherworld. When the darkness cleared, Jackson and his team found themselves in a gloomy, mysterious landscape. Dark forests, barren fields, and ruins of ancient buildings stretched before them. A thick fog hung in the air, and the sky was shrouded in dark clouds, occasionally pierced by lightning. "We're really here," Jackson said, looking around. "This is the shadow world." "But how do we get back?" Elizabeth asked, staring at the vanished portal. "We need to find a way out of here." "First, we need to understand where we are and what we need to do," Professor Carter said. "This world is full of dangers, and we don't know what we might encounter." They began moving forward, trying to stay together. Every step was difficult, as if the air itself was trying to slow them down. Strange sounds and whispers surrounded them from all sides, heightening their sense of unease, searching for answers. After several hours of wandering, they stumbled upon an ancient, half-ruined, overgrown temple. Jackson felt this place was important to their mission. "Let's go inside," he suggested. "Maybe we'll find answers here." Inside the temple, darkness prevailed, and every sound echoed off the stone walls. They moved forward, lighting their way with torches. In the center of the hall, they found a large altar with an ancient book on it. "Another ancient book," Alexei said, carefully opening it. "This might hold the keys to understanding this world." They began studying the book and soon discovered it contained information on rituals and spells that could help them control and protect themselves from the shadows. Additionally, they found mention of a mysterious artifact capable of closing the gates forever. "We need to find this artifact," Jackson said. "It's our only chance." Journey into the depths of the shadow world. With the book in hand and a new goal, the team continued their journey through the dark shadow world. They crossed dark forests where strange creatures watched them from the shadows and barren plains where each step echoed. One night, while they were resting, a spirit in the form of an old sage appeared before them. "Who are you and what do you seek in this world?" he asked. "We've come to find an artifact that can close the gates forever," Jackson replied. "We want to stop the shadows and protect our world." "Your path is fraught with danger," the spirit said, "but I will help you. Go to the old city in the west. There you will find what you seek." The old city. Following the spirit's directions, the team headed west and soon reached the ruins of an ancient city. The city was empty and abandoned, but in its center, they found an ancient temple similar to the one they had seen before. Inside the temple, they discovered a statue holding a glowing artifact. When Jackson tried to take it, shadows began to surround them. "We need to act quickly," Professor Carter said. The shadows won't let us leave so easily. Elizabeth began chanting spells from the book to protect them from the shadows. Alexei and Professor Graves supported her, strengthening the magical circle. Jackson took the artifact and felt the power emanating from it. "We need to return to the gates and close them," he said. "This is our chance. Return to the gates." The team began their journey back, trying to avoid encounters with the shadows. They knew every minute counted. When they returned to the gates, the portal was still open, and shadows continued to penetrate their world. "Quickly, let's start the ritual," Jackson said, standing in the center of the magical circle. Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves stood around him, holding the artifacts. They began reciting spells, and the artifact in Jackson's hands glowed with a bright light. The portal began to close, and the shadows started to retreat. Suddenly, a massive shadow emerged from the portal, ready to attack them. Jackson raised the artifact and directed its light at the shadow. It screamed and began to disappear, dissolving into the air. The portal closed, and the world was once again engulfed in silence. Jackson and his team felt a sense of relief and exhaustion. They knew they had managed to close the gates and rid themselves of the shadows forever. Aftermath. Back at the university, Jackson, Elizabeth, Alexei, Professor Carter, and Professor Graves began analyzing their adventures and studying the artifact. They realized their mission was not just to close the gates, but to understand the nature of the shadows in their world. "We need to continue our research," Jackson said. "This world is full of mysteries, and we have a lot of work ahead of us." They knew the shadow world was not fully revealed, and that their knowledge could help protect their world from future threats. Their goal was now clear: to study the secrets of the shadows and use their knowledge to protect humanity.